Okay. So on the COVID issue, I think the illustration given by Eduardo is a very nice illustration of good, solid, applied work to be done by a regional scientist and urban economist on what to do. And what I can see is there's an enormous volume of new research coming up. We were just used a little bit in our field on resilience models and resilience science, etc., because we had overcome the crisis, and then the crisis 2008 to 2012 was a nice illustration of going through a dip and then gradually coming out, again the battle uphill. And so what we see now, we are lucky that many people had done quite some resilience research, and that can now immediately be applied. And I see already many papers, articles coming up on resilience research, and the work done by Eduardo, I think, is very interesting. New research we'll see also, and we see already coming up very fastly, in the tourism sector, because that's the sector mostly affected by Corona, and also together with our friends in Sweden and Turkey, we have been working on big data and Airbnb bookings and cancellations, and the competition between Airbnb and the hotel sector, which is very interesting. By the way, the first findings over the first 6 months until August, we have the data until end of August this year. Very interesting. Of course, the whole market collapsed. That is quite clear. But the hotel market collapsed even more than the Airbnb market. But some segments of the Airbnb market almost disappeared, by the way, but others were still rather stable. And you know which segments were rather stable? The ones who were renting separate private apartments. So no interaction with other people. As soon as you have to share an apartment or a room, etc., with others, that was completely out of the ball. But the more expensive Airbnb segments are still doing very well, and in fact have almost returned to where they were before. So we see a splitting up of the market. Now there are hundreds of these types of questions, which I think is very interesting. And it would be nice if this could also be articulated in our research, and there's quite some work also to be done for Portugal, because and for the islands, because this is one of the tourist areas, so that is, and the same for Algarve and so on, Madeira. So I think that could be very interesting. I also have a question yeah? Can I ask you a question to Andrés? Because Andrés and I are always involved in very friendly debates. So I admire his presentation. I would almost be inclined to believe what he said, provided he would give an answer to a few pressing questions I still have. First, could you explain to us, Andrés, what is the causality between failing investments in infrastructure and low institutional quality? Things might fail for many reasons, and I would like to see a causal explanation. Why is this due to a weak institutional quality? The market might just change and things might fail. That's my first question. A second question, if you look into billions of airports which are empty, yes, but is the share of failing parts in the public budget of a government, regional, national, doesn't matter, is that significant? If it is only 1% over many years, is that a problem? In the business sector, we make failures all the time. And the question is whether governments are underperforming compared to the private sector. And I would like to see that type of, let's say, comparative analysis based on quantitative figures. And the final thing is, because you are mainly not exclusively, mainly talk about infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, of course, is indivisible. You build an airport or no airport. You cannot build half an airport or half a runway. You build a motorway or you do not build a motorway, and you have to look forward into what will be the use in 50 years from now. That's more or less the spectrum. And I give you one example. Some time ago I was traveling or riding by car, driving a car in eastern Turkey near the Syrian-Armenian border. Beautiful motorways, the best maybe in the whole of Europe and the Middle East. Fantastic. Every 15 minutes, maybe there's a car. You might say, well, that's a failure because it's empty. Erdogan would say, great investment, because it links the Kurdic part of Turkey with the western part. It's a political motive. It has nothing to do with the economy. It's a political motive. That was the motive, by the way, also used by Hitler when he was building the autobahns before the war. There were hardly cars, but there were big autobahns and no cars. But it helped to unite Germany. Right? So there might be other arguments. So is the economic argument the valid or exclusively valid argument to judge the success of infrastructure investments?
Andrés, can you reply on these 3 questions?
Okay. Sure. Microphone. Thank you very much, Peter, for putting me on the spot. Now I'm going to have to defend myself. Causality. Well, the thing about the causality is you can say it can go both ways, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. That if you have poor projects, that leads to a decline in institutions. If you have poor institutions, it leads to bad projects. But having said that, if you want causality, and I think we need to understand all directions of causality, but if you want causality, what we have to take a look is at what has been done in many countries when money for recovery has been available in different periods of crisis. And if in the 1970s and the recovery, in the 1980s and the recovery, in the 1990s and the recovery, in 2008 and the recovery, and now in this post-COVID, the talks are very much the same. Let's put money into building something. Why? Because it's easy, because it's transparent. You have no motorway and you have a motorway. If you have someone who's skilled, not skilled, and then after 5 years it takes time, it's more complicated, it has an additional amount of, let's say, managerial intricacies. And then you end up with someone who has been trained who looks exactly the same. You cannot get those political returns. So in the end, when you are repeating the same mistakes over and over and over again, probably the causality is from weak institutions that are becoming weaker towards inefficient projects and not vice versa. Second, rate of failure. Can government fail? Yes. Is government entitled to fail? Yes. But the problem is not that you fail in 1% or 2%. The investment in infrastructure might be significant, maintenance is significant, but it's not just infrastructure projects. It's education. You're investing in education, but sometimes you're increasing, but not increasing the quality. When you have the PISA, not the PISA reports, the PIAC reports, and I'm just going to put, Portugal, by the way, was for a long time the country with the biggest high school dropouts when it was investing highly in Europe. It was investing highly in infrastructure. But in Spain, you have the PIAC analysis of 30-year-olds in working, and then it comes out that a Spanish graduate has got the same cognitive capacity at 30 than a university graduate, than a Dutch high school graduate. And that people, they tend to dismiss it. Now we are seeing that in the case of Spain, the PISA results are slipping down and they're going worse every year. The problem is not that the Spanish system, according to the Spanish system, is in crisis. The problem is that the methodology is wrong. And this is one of the things that is a clear example of failure. When you're doing support for innovation or support for entrepreneurship, if rather than subsidizing and supporting the worthy projects, you subsidize because you are in a nepotistic and corrupt system, those of your cousin, or the friend of your cousin, or the friend of the cousin of the friend of the cousin, then you end up, that is not 1% that's failure, it's the whole system that is failing. And when you have public expenditure that in most European countries represents somewhere between 30% to 60% of GDP, you're talking about a systemic failure. Then political criteria or economic criteria, I'm going to turn your argument around. First is the two-way road argument. You connect and if you put roads in Eastern Anatolia and there are no cars, and there's nothing, but those roads facilitate people to migrate, and then go for 3 or 4 weeks on holidays to the villages of origin, you're not making your country more cohesive. You're making it least cohesive. That's what we're seeing. I'm going to talk about Spain, but it's the same in Portugal. Portugal is fantastically connected by motorway. It's a relatively small country. And of course, that has facilitated the concentration, which was already there, of population on the coast, on the most dynamic area, leaving a lot of other spaces behind. So in the end, you say, maybe for political reasons, you want to get to Bragança, you want to get to Trás-os-Montes, you want to get to remote areas of Spain. But that implies that everyone with capacity, the young, the dynamic, those that can change, end up moving. Rather than a more cohesive country, what you have is a country of dynamic spaces, mainly in a few cities, the left behind, and you have massive political tensions that are given rise in most of our countries to the rise of anti-system radical parties that are threatening to tear apart the system that, with all its problems, has delivered the longest period of peace in Europe has witnessed, the longest prosperity, and the smallest level of inequality. If we think that by doing all these policies, or policies that are a failure, we're going to achieve other types of goals, I think you need to look at sustainability is political, it's economic, it's social, it's environmental, and very often they all go hand in hand.
Thank you, Andrés, for answering the question. Peter, thank you for your question. We still have Eduardo. Eduardo, would you like to reflect on these two presentations? From your research, the impact of COVID-19 in regional development, if we talk about here, on institutions, government, and big data?
Well, thank you, Karima. I think I'm going. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. I think I'll put everything into the same basket, the 3 papers, to tell you about this recent experience we had while doing this work for the state government. It's about data, it's about institutions, and it's about having timely access to data that, as Peter said, data now has value, right? But in a urgent situation as we're living now, there was an effort of the public sector, of the private sector, and of researchers to get answers quickly. And in doing that, I never lived a situation before where all the data demand that we had was promptly responded timely. The government put a lot of resource to get the data that we asked for. The private sector provided infrastructure in terms of IT, the telecommunication enterprise. They provided the data, the individual data by the cell phones for everybody to build a huge dashboard so that researchers would have access and together dealing with these problems. So there was a quick and prompt institutional response to a specific problem where all the state intelligentsia were looking for, and the data which was key for all the decisions that were taken here in the state in the last 5 months, very precious data. They were put freely for the scientific community to look properly at the problem that we are facing. So, I mean, that's a typical situation where everything converged to try to solve a problem that was hampering, that hit the society very strongly. That's not going to be the usual way of having access to data, of having this institutional commitment, but I think our society has shown here that it's possible, right? But there is a cost, and whenever we have other activities that are going to be done after the pandemic, I don't know how to maintain this effort, this convergence of institutional effort that provided quick access to this precious information, that's data that helped improve a lot the design, the implementation, and the monitoring of policies here in the state, but for a very specific problem.
Thank you very much, Eduardo, for your reflection on your research, including these presentations. I would like to ask the audience some questions and suggestions based on this discussion and the presentations. Some ideas? How do you work here on, for instance, the impact of COVID-19 in combination with data, institutions, some decisions, policy and strategy? How do you translate that? Are you using data in the research, in the decision-making process? Who can help me here with this question? Okay, Thomas.
Well, simply about the panel was very interesting because on one hand you have Eduardo that was asked by the government to solve a real issue that every country has. So we need at the same time to save lives and to save jobs, and he has done a splendid work. And then he asks, can we use this tool, this approach, to solve other problems, for instance, crime or famine or whatever, and have this data that you call to solve problems of the society in every level of society. The floods that are all over the world and eventually killing more people than COVID, and so that's, I think, a good example that Eduardo has shown us is that there is some clear aim of the society and the government to solve the problem. On the other part, you have this threshold of money that somehow, if we reach a certain level, if it is too much, then it creates corruption, or the money is not well spent, or somehow there is a rent created by the fiscal system, by the institutions itself, and these type of rents then are difficult to change. When you create a rent that's, for instance, the medical doctors or the pharmaceuticals or the taxi drivers or whatever, then have an income from that, then of course you create, it is not, even the system itself is corrupt. Like in Angola, you have the formal corruption and then the informal corruption. Usually the formal corruption is in Luanda, the informal corruption is in the countryside. And this is, and the problem we have now is that we have many rules in Europe and in Portugal that in fact they create by themselves rents. And so it is not, you just not have informal corruption, we have a formal corruption that somehow the institutions don't change because most of the people defend us, for instance, certainty of jobs in the public sector. And then it's the majority of the population and families, and of course, people don't want to change this system that in itself, it will break. And that's the challenge. So the institutions is, in terms of my questions, how we are able to change institutions through, not through the democratic system only. What is the system that we adapt the institutions to the challenge, avoiding or controlling for the rents each institutions create? And we talk about rents, but nowadays in a more developed society, everybody can live on rents. The Western world is living on rents. So we are paying the northern countries interest rates every time that you are receiving through the banking system because we were bankrupt in the... So this is a rent of the north because we are paying someone that somehow the increase, the growth of Portugal was 2 or 3% lower than it should be because of the interest rates, and it will be like that, the growth of the Azores and the growth of every in-depth country. So I think that this capacity to look of these transfers of money that does not depend directly on the productivity of these people, that I think these are the money that maintain institutions, which sometimes they are good because, of course, you have money from financial times and for rents and so on, but the capacity to change those rents and those institutions is that I think we are lacking. And then, of course, in the South, we create once in a while a revolution or the yellow jackets or whatever. And this is knowledge that we need a dashboard and a solution, and we don't have the solution for that change, I think. But eventually you have a solution for those rents that somehow go to somewhere and they are not necessarily efficient in the way they are distributed.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Okay. Oh, great. Can you please stand up? Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll sit over here. Okay. Thank you. Interesting presentations. I would like to ask you to elaborate a little more on institutions. Which institutions? Are we talking about the private sector, public entrepreneurial sector, or politicians or political systems? Because I think there's a lot to be learned about the contribution of each one of them to the overall outcome. So, and this is something you didn't elaborate. We talk about institutions, but which institutions? Okay, there's some work done by Robinson and Acemoglu on the quality of institutions and why nations fail. Okay, why some are better than others in terms of development, and it goes beyond the institutions. It goes towards the principles that govern the institutions, and the principles, I think, are very important. And this is one issue that I posed to the speakers. One other issue that Peter brought up, some infrastructure is very nice. Of course, an airport is very nice. A road is very nice. We have some very nice roads over here. But the question is, what's the opportunity cost of doing that road or doing that airport? What's the opportunity cost? How long is it going to be before you can even expect to have a little bit of return on those investments? Because meanwhile, what happens in society is without that, the value of that investment, and sometimes it's even paying interest because it had to finance those investments also. Okay, and I think the two are somewhat related, quality of institutions and the outcome of investments, because those investments are typically investments decided by politicians. And the question is, what are they maximizing? Are they maximizing public well-being or the probability of being re-elected? I think that's a big issue, and that issue should be, I think, linked to the quality of institutions, because a lot of poor institutional positioning has to do, I think, with political options being mixed with supposedly social benefits to the public in general, which is a lie in many instances, because it's the poor that typically are out of the benefits of these mega infrastructures. So those are the two issues that I would like to pose. Two questions.
A long story, two questions. Thank you. I start with Eduardo.
Yeah, all right. So I'll try to keep it short. Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. Type of institutions, and then I'm going to go to Tomás Dentinho. Here I will distinguish between formal and informal institutions. Formal institutions, the ones that normally economists talk about, including Acemoglu and Robinson, tend to be protection of private property, rule of law, etc. The good thing, in principle in Europe, that on paper, those institutions are well functioning everywhere you are in the European Union. In reality, it's another matter, but the gap is not that big. I'm focusing mainly on the informal institutions, which are the way, the habits, the customs, the norms that actually govern everything, and that create the trust in the system. So how do we overcome and how do we improve institutions? The whole idea is to improve trust, to generate trust in the system, in how things work, that the system works in a fair way. And that reduces transaction costs, that encourages economic activity and the generation of sustainable employment, etc. When you have low trust, people don't follow up the norms, and you end up with levels of contagion like in Spain, for example, in COVID, because people don't follow the norms, or many people don't follow the norms, despite the fact that in principle they say they do. The problem here is, how do you generate trust? And I think there are three ways of going about this. The first way is fundamentally through participation. Participation and voice and transparency. Give people voice. Make sure that people are heard, and they feel they're heard. They feel they're part of the system, and they got a stake in the system. And this is something that in many countries we have failed to do that in an adequate way. The second way is simplification. Simplify rules. If you make everything more complicated, you are encouraging not just a waste of resources, because it takes more time to open a firm or to get a subsidy or get support or get the right policy. It also generates rents that are coming. When you simplify, you do like in Estonia, and you make it transparent. You put it on the internet, and everyone knows who's getting what and why they're getting it for, etc. Then you are increasing trust in the system in another way. And the third thing, the final thing, is accountability. Accountability in terms of economic accountability, but also legal accountability. If you have decision makers or whoever in the private sector that pays bribes and takes bribes and nothing happens, or if it happens is minimal and the money never appears, then you're going to have what Tomás was saying for Angola, not just corruption at high level and everywhere. You're going to have corruption everywhere throughout the whole system. And the whole system is going to lose trust. I think if you go for those three principles, it's not that it's going to be the magic wand, but you have a big chance that institutions and weak institutions that are actually poisoning the system might start working much, much better and deliver a much more sustainable type of, in this case, economic activity, but it would be, I would say, also social, environmental, and political system.
Thank you, Andrés. Peter, please keep it short, because I would like to give...
Sure. The first statement, institutions is actors plus rules. And actors can look into substantive issues, they have to look into political deliberations, but rules are rules. And institutions and actors have to respect the rules. It might be that institutions might act properly, that we have the wrong rules. But institutions are bound to follow the rules. If you don't follow the rules, they will be in deep trouble. So the question is, do we have the wrong institutions or do we have the wrong rules? And not all rules are applicable to any kind of public decision. They were not made for any specific thing, they're more general. And I can tell you many stories about rules which did not apply, but they had to be followed. And of course you get suboptimal decisions. So that's number one. Number two, one also ought to appreciate that in the public sector is not just a pool of money, it's budgetary segmentation. A Minister of Health, a Minister of Agriculture, a Minister of Transport has a certain budget. And that budget has to be spent in 1 year on certain things which belong to the competence or the remit of that ministry or that mayor or whatever. So if there is money for infrastructure, you could say, well, it's wrong, we should have spent it maybe on education or on health, but that's a different competence of a different stakeholder. So there might be institutional failures, but they are not, in fact, they have nothing to do with the fact that we have the wrong people in the wrong institutions, but we have created the whole, maybe strange infrastructure. I give you one example nowadays. Yep, final. Yeah, okay. One small example. Nowadays, airlines are in deep trouble. So the French government pays, I think, 7 billion or so to Air France. The Austrian government, 500 million to Austrian Airlines. The Dutch government, 2 billion to KLM, etc. And I'm sure Portugal does the same. Okay. Even though we have given up the idea of flag carriers, but now we suddenly want to pay for them. Is this good or bad? People say, well, give it to climate adaptation, give it to human health, good environment. But that's a different minister. So it does not work. So the rules forbid you even to do that type of transgression of the competencies of stakeholders. Could be aldermen, it could be ministers, etc. That makes it, the budgetary segmentation is a major cause maybe of less optimal spending of public money. The money has to be spent, otherwise you lose it. Finally then, is it true that weak institutional quality is always linked with corruption? And is corruption always bad? I know countries where without corruption the people would not survive. So is corruption always bad? If I look into the human side, I have some sympathy for corruption, in some countries at least.
Thank you very much, Peter. Okay. Eduardo, very short, please. I would like... Oh, okay. We cannot hear Eduardo. We cannot hear Eduardo.
It was a very good question. I just want to
keep it short, please. Keep it short.
Very short.
Thank you. Okay.
But once we recognize the opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost is very high, and it's wide across the society, as we are having here in the case of the pandemic, we find ways of the actors, even under the existing rules, so institutions find a way to solve the problem. So that's true. So we see here a radical and extreme case with a very high opportunity cost affecting the whole society that organized institutional convergence to solve it. That's my point. Okay. Thank you, Karima. Shukran.
لا شكرا على واجب. Thank you very much, Eduardo, for being a part of this session, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your work with us. Thank you very much. Peter Nijkamp, you too, thank you very much. Andrés, Rodríguez, thank you very much. This is not the final. We should organize more of these kinds of meetings, so there is more to share, and I hope next time we can hear also your experiences and also your research and knowledge to share this with us. So thank you very much. Thank you all. Thomas, thank you. The floor is yours. Okay.